viewing quarterly reports in his 20th floor office when the ground began to tremble. At first, he thought it might be construction work from the building site across the street, but the gentle swaying quickly became violent shaking that sent his coffee mug crashing to the floor and made his desk lamp dance wildly. Earthquake struck with the fury of an angry giant shaking a dollhouse, grabbed onto his desk as the entire building swayed back and forth like a ship in a storm. Through his window, he could see other skyscrapers bending and twisting in ways that seemed impossible for structures made of steel and concrete. Tumbled from shelves, ceiling tiles crashed down around him, and the fluorescent lights flickered and went out. The emergency lighting system kicked in, casting an eerie red glow throughout the office space. Could hear screaming from other floors and the groaning of the building's structure as it fought against forces beyond its design limits. The shaking finally stopped after what felt like hours but was probably only 90 seconds, found himself on his hands and knees beneath his heavy oak desk. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the earthquake itself. No traffic sounds from the street below, no hum of air conditioning, no normal office chatter. Just an ominous creaking as the building settled into its new, damaged state. He out from under his desk and looked around in shock. His corner office was destroyed. The large window that had given him such a beautiful view of the city was now a spiderweb of cracks, held together only by the safety film. Water was spraying from a broken pipe somewhere in the ceiling, and sparks occasionally shot from damaged electrical outlets. Tried his desk phone, but there was no dial tone. His cell phone showed no signal bars. The elevators were obviously out of service, and he could smell smoke coming from somewhere in the building. Realized with growing dread that he was trapped 20 floors above the ground in a severely damaged building that might collapse at any moment. Stairwell door was jammed shut, warped in its frame by the building's movement during the earthquake. Threw his shoulder against it repeatedly until it finally gave way with a sharp crack. The emergency stairwell was dimly lit and filled with dust and debris. He could hear voices echoing from below, other survivors making their way down the stairs. Again his descent, he encountered Jenny from accounting on the 18th floor. She was sitting on the stairs, holding her ankle and crying. Her leg was clearly broken with bone protruding through the skin. Blood was pooling beneath her and she was going into shock. "Can't walk," she whispered through chattering teeth. "The stairs collapsed under me when I tried to go down. I think I'm going to die here." He couldn't carry Jenny down 18 flights of stairs, but he also couldn't leave her behind. He used his belt as a tourniquet to stop the bleeding and tore his shirt to create a makeshift splint. From his office supplies, he found pain medication that Jenny kept for her migraines and gave her several tablets to help with the agony. "We're going to get out of here together," told her, though he had no idea how he was going to make that happen. "I'm not leaving you behind." Building shook again with a powerful aftershock that sent more debris raining down the stairwell, shielded Jenny with his body as chunks of concrete bounced off his back. Somewhere below them, he heard a tremendous crash followed by screams. Part of the stairway had collapsed, cutting off their route to safety. Jenny moved up a few floors to the 22nd level, where they found an abandoned office with a view of the street. What he saw through the cracked windows made his blood run cold. The entire downtown area looked like a war zone. Buildings had collapsed into piles of rubble, fires were burning out of control, and emergency vehicles were racing through streets filled with debris and abandoned cars. Hospital across the street had partially collapsed, its emergency room buried under tons of concrete. Fire trucks were spraying water on burning buildings, but there were clearly more fires than the fire department could handle. In the distance, could see that several freeway overpasses had collapsed, trapping cars beneath massive concrete slabs. He was becoming increasingly delirious from blood loss and shock. Found a first aid kit in the office and managed to better bandage her wound, but she needed professional medical attention that wasn't available. The city's emergency services were completely overwhelmed by the disaster. As evening approached, the temperature in the building began to drop. The heating system was not working, and cold air was flowing through the many cracks and broken windows. Gathered off supplies to create insulation and found some snack food in desk drawers to keep their energy up. The night, they could hear other survivors in different parts of the building calling for help. Tried to respond by banging on pipes and yelling, but the building was too damaged for effective communication. He could only hope that rescue teams were working their way up from below. The day brought more aftershocks, each one threatening to bring down the already weakened structure. Rationed their small supply of food and water, knowing they might be trapped for days before rescue arrived. Jenny's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and knew she would die without immediate medical care. One of his searches for supplies discovered that the building's communication equipment on the roof was still partially functional. Using his knowledge of electronics from his college engineering classes, he managed to jury-rig a distress beacon using parts from office equipment and building wiring. Beacon transmitted their location and the number of survivors to emergency frequencies, but had no way of knowing if anyone was receiving the signal. All he could do was keep transmitting and hope that rescue teams had equipment capable of picking up their calls for help. The third day, Jenny lost consciousness, and her breathing became shallow and irregular. Did everything he could to keep her warm and comfortable, but without medical equipment, he was helpless to save her. He held her hand and talked to her about her family and her dreams, hoping she could hear him even though she could no longer respond. Beginning to feel the effects of dehydration and exposure himself. The constant stress and lack of proper food were taking their toll on his body and mind. He found himself becoming forgetful and having trouble concentrating on simple tasks. Several times, he caught himself falling asleep while trying to maintain their signal beacon. In the afternoon of the third day, heard the unmistakable sound of a helicopter circling the building. He managed to get to a window and wave a bright yellow safety vest he had found in a maintenance closet. The helicopter pilot saw him and hovered close to the building while rescue personnel rappelled down ropes to reach their floor. First rescuer through the window was Captain from the Urban Search and Rescue Team. He quickly assessed the situation and called for medical equipment to be lowered from the helicopter. Within minutes, paramedics were working to stabilize Jenny while was checked for injuries and dehydration. "How many other survivors are in the building?" Captain asked as his team prepared to evacuate them. "Don't know," replied Weekly. "I've been hearing voices from other floors, but I couldn't reach them. The stairways are blocked in several places." Rescue team worked quickly to get and Jenny into rescue harnesses and lift them up to the waiting helicopter. As they rose into the air, could see the full extent of the devastation below. Entire city blocks had been reduced to rubble, and smoke was still rising from dozens of fires throughout the metropolitan area. Magnitude 7.8 earthquake had been the largest to hit the region in over a century, and the damage was beyond anything emergency planners had imagined. Thousands of people were dead or missing, and hundreds of thousands more were homeless. The city's infrastructure had been completely destroyed, and it would take years to rebuild. The helicopter landed at a makeshift metal station set up in the city's main park, one of the few large open spaces that hadn't been damaged by the earthquake. Hundreds of injured survivors were lying on stretchers and blankets spread across the grass, being treated by an overwhelmed medical staff working under canvas tents. It was immediately rushed to surgery in a mobile medical unit, while was taken to a triage area where a tired-looking doctor examined him for injuries. Aside from cuts, bruises, and dehydration, was in remarkably good condition considering his 3-day ordeal in the damaged building. "Lucky to be alive," the doctor told him as she cleaned the wounds on his hands and arms. "That building you were in collapsed completely about an hour after we got you out. The rescue team barely made it out themselves." Sick as he realized how close they had come to death. If the helicopter hadn't spotted his signal when it did, he and Jenny would have been buried under tons of concrete and steel. He thought about the other voices he had heard in the building and wondered how many people had been trapped when it finally came down. The temporary metal station was chaotic and overcrowded. Medical supplies were running dangerously low, and doctors were being forced to make difficult decisions about which patients to treat first. The city's hospitals had either been destroyed or severely damaged, leaving only these field hospitals to handle thousands of injured survivors. Volunteered to help wherever he could, despite his own exhaustion. He had no medical training, but he could carry supplies, comfort frightened children, and help coordinate the constant stream of helicopters bringing in more survivors from collapsed buildings throughout the city. As he worked, learned the full scope of the disaster from rescue workers and other volunteers. The earthquake had triggered massive landslides in the surrounding mountains, blocking major highways and cutting off supply lines to the city. The airport had been destroyed, and the seaport was unusable due to damage from the tsunami that had followed the earthquake. Communication systems were down throughout the region, making it impossible for families to find each other or for authorities to coordinate rescue efforts effectively. The power grid had failed completely, and water treatment plants had been damaged, leaving the entire metropolitan area without clean drinking water. Well, emergency management teams were flying in supplies and personnel, but the scale of the disaster was overwhelming their resources. International aid was being offered by dozens of countries, but getting supplies to the affected area was proving extremely difficult due to the damaged infrastructure. His second day at the metal station was asked to join a search and rescue team as a guide, since he knew the downtown area well from his years working there. The team was composed of firefighters, paramedics, and volunteers who were systematically searching through collapsed buildings looking for survivors. The station was worse than anything could have imagined. Entire city blocks had been reduced to piles of rubble and twisted metal. Cars were crushed flat under concrete slabs, and bodies were still being pulled from the wreckage of what had once been busy office buildings and shopping centers. Sensitive listening equipment, the search teams could sometimes hear survivors trapped deep within the debris. The rescue process was incredibly slow and dangerous, as workers had to carefully remove tons of concrete and steel without causing further collapses that could kill both the trapped victims and the rescuers themselves. Guide the team to his former office building, or what was left of it. The structure had pancaked when it collapsed, with each floor falling onto the one below it. The rescue team leader estimated that anyone who had been inside would have been killed instantly when the building came down. In the rubble of what had been his workplace for 5 years, felt overwhelmed by survivor's guilt. Why had he lived when so many others had died? His colleagues, the security guards, the cleaning staff, dozens of people he had worked with every day were now buried somewhere in the pile of debris at his feet. Their team used specialized cameras and microphones to probe deep into the wreckage, but they found no signs of life. After 8 hours of careful searching, they moved on to the next collapsed building on their list. There were hundreds of such sites throughout the city, and the rescue teams knew they could only search a fraction of them before any remaining survivors would succumb to their injuries. That evening was reunited with Jenny at the metal station. She had survived surgery to repair her leg, but doctors warned that she might never walk normally again. Despite her pain and uncertain future, she was grateful to be alive and kept thanking for staying with her in the building. "You saved my life," she told him through tears. "You could have left me and gone out sooner, but you stayed. I'll never forget that." And that his apartment building had also been severely damaged, though it hadn't collapsed completely. Most of his possessions were buried under debris or damaged beyond repair, but somehow his photo albums and some important documents had survived in a closet that had remained intact. City government had set up evacuation centers in schools and community buildings outside the earthquake zone, and was transported there along with thousands of other displaced residents. The centers were overcrowded and uncomfortable, with families sleeping on cots in gymnasiums and cafeterias, but they provided basic shelter and food for people who had lost everything. In the evacuation center was emotionally challenging for everyone there had lost homes, belongings, and often family members in the disaster. Children cried constantly, separated from parents or traumatized by what they had witnessed. Adults struggled with depression and anxiety, uncertain about their futures and how they would rebuild their lives. That helping others gave him a sense of purpose and helped him cope with his own trauma. He organized activities for children, helped elderly residents navigate the complex process of applying for disaster assistance, and served meals in the center's cafeteria. The work was exhausting, but it kept him focused on moving forward rather than dwelling on everything he had lost. His reports showed that the earthquake had affected an area of over 50,000 square miles, with major damage in 6 different states. The death toll was climbing toward 15,000 people, with tens of thousands more still missing and presumed dead. Economic losses were estimated to be over $200 billion, making it one of the costliest natural disasters in the nation's history. Recovery efforts were hampered by continued aftershocks, some of which were strong enough to bring down buildings that had been damaged, but still standing. Rescue workers were forced to suspend operations several times when seismologists warned of particularly dangerous aftershock periods. Weeks after the earthquake, was finally able to return to what remained of his neighborhood to salvage what he could from his apartment. The building was marked with a red tag, indicating that it was unsafe to enter, but residents were allowed brief supervised visits to retrieve essential items. Through his damaged apartment was like visiting a museum of his former life. Furniture was overturned and broken, dishes were shattered on the floor, and water damage from broken pipes had ruined most of his clothing and electronics. But in the bedroom closet, he found a waterproof box containing family photos, his passport, and other irreplaceable documents. Sorted through the wreckage of his home, he realized that most of the things he had thought were important before the earthquake now seemed trivial. The expensive television, the designer furniture, the collection of books he had planned to read someday, none of it mattered now. What mattered was being alive and having the chance to rebuild. Experience of surviving the earthquake and its aftermath had fundamentally changed his perspective on life. He found himself thinking more about relationships and experiences than about material possessions. The trauma had been terrible, but it had also taught him lessons about resilience, community, and what truly mattered in life. 6 months after the earthquake, was living in a temporary housing unit provided by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Small trailer was cramped and basic, but it was warm, dry, and safe luxuries he no longer took for granted. His insurance settlement had finally come through, though it covered only a fraction of what he had lost in the disaster. City was slowly beginning to rebuild, but progress was painfully slow. Engineers had to carefully inspect every remaining structure before people could return to work or live in their homes. Many buildings that had appeared undamaged from the outside turned out to have serious structural problems that made them unsafe to occupy. Been hired by the city planning department to help coordinate reconstruction efforts. His experience as a survivor, combined with his business background, made him valuable in designing new building codes and emergency response procedures. The work was meaningful but emotionally difficult, as he daily confronted reminders of the destruction and loss. Psychological impact of the earthquake affected every survivor differently. Found himself jumping at sudden noises and feeling anxious whenever he felt any vibration that might indicate another earthquake. He attended support group meetings with other survivors, where people shared their experiences and coping strategies. He had been fitted with a prosthetic device that allowed her to walk with the aid of a cane, though she still experienced chronic pain from her injuries. She had become an advocate for improved building safety standards, testifying before legislative committees about the need for stricter earthquake-resistant construction requirements. Survivors struggled with what psychologists called disaster guilt, the feeling that they somehow didn't deserve to have lived when so many others had died. Experienced this intensely, especially when he learned that 12 of his former colleagues had perished when their office building collapsed. He attended memorial services and tried to honor their memory through his work on earthquake preparedness. The economic impact of the disaster was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of jobs had been lost when businesses were destroyed or forced to relocate. The tourism industry, which had been a major part of the regional economy, virtually disappeared as visitors stayed away from the earthquake zone. Federal disaster assistance helped many families, but the bureaucratic process was slow and often frustrating. A year after the earthquake, participated in a remembrance ceremony held in the main park where the metal station had been set up. Thousands of people gathered to honor the victims and celebrate the resilience of the survivors. The governor spoke about the community's strength in facing adversity, and religious leaders from many faiths offered prayers for healing and hope. In the ceremony, was surprised to be called to the podium to receive a Civilian Heroism Award for his actions in saving Jenny's life and his volunteer work during the rescue efforts. As he accepted the medal, he thought about all the people who had shown similar courage and selflessness during and after the disaster. Real heroes, said in his brief acceptance speech, are the ordinary people who chose to help their neighbors when everything seemed hopeless. The earthquake showed us how vulnerable we all are, but it also showed us how strong we can be when we work together. The building process was creating a new kind of city, designed with earthquake safety as a primary consideration. New buildings were constructed with advanced seismic engineering, and older structures were retrofitted with earthquake-resistant features. Emergency response systems were completely redesigned based on lessons learned from the disaster. He was involved in community emergency preparedness programs, teaching residents how to create disaster supply kits, develop family communication plans, and practice earthquake-safe procedures. He knew that another major earthquake was inevitable in the seismically active region, and he was determined to help people be better prepared. Years after the earthquake, was appointed to serve on the State Earthquake Safety Commission, where he helped develop new policies for disaster response and building standards. His first-hand experience as a survivor gave him credibility when speaking to lawmakers and community groups about the importance of earthquake preparedness. Mission's work led to significant improvements in earthquake early warning systems, which could now provide up to 60 seconds of warning before strong shaking reached populated areas. Those precious seconds could allow people to take cover, stop elevators at the nearest floor, and automatically shut down gas lines and other hazard systems. So worked with schools to develop better earthquake-safe protocols for students and staff. Children who experienced the earthquake often suffered from anxiety and fear about future disasters, and schools needed specialized programs to help them cope with their trauma while also teaching them practical safety skills. 5 years after the disaster, the rebuilt downtown area was actually more vibrant and economically successful than it had been before the earthquake. New businesses had moved in to replace those that were destroyed, and the improved infrastructure made the area more attractive for investment and development. Married Sarah, a trauma counselor he met during his volunteer work at the evacuation center. They had 2 children and lived in a new home designed to the most stringent earthquake safety standards. Their basement contained a comprehensive emergency supply kit, and the family practiced earthquake drills regularly. Experience of surviving the earthquake had taught that disaster preparedness was not just about having the right supplies or following the correct procedures. It was also about building community connections and developing the psychological resilience needed to cope with trauma and loss. I often spoke to groups about the importance of both physical and emotional preparedness for disasters. You can have all the emergency supplies in the world, he would tell audiences, but if you don't have the mental strength to use them effectively and the community support to help you through the crisis, you're still vulnerable. He maintained contact with many of the other survivors from his office building, and they met annually on the anniversary of the earthquake to remember those who had died and celebrate their own survival. These gatherings had evolved from somber memorial services to more hopeful celebrations of resilience and recovery. The quake had taken away Soul's life completely, his job, his home, his possessions, and many of his friends. But in return, it had given him a deeper understanding of what truly mattered and a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. His work in disaster preparedness was saving lives and helping communities become more resilient. Years after the earthquake, was director of the Regional Emergency Management Agency, responsible for coordinating disaster response across multiple counties. The agency's headquarters was located in a building specifically designed to remain operational during major earthquakes, with backup power systems, satellite communications, and underground emergency supplies. The building also housed a museum dedicated to the earthquake and its aftermath, where visitors could learn about disaster preparedness and view artifacts from the rescue efforts. Had donated the yellow safety vest he had used to signal the rescue helicopter, along with other items from his 3 days trapped in the collapsed building. Groups regularly toured the facility and often spoke to them about the importance of being prepared for disasters. He emphasized that while they couldn't prevent earthquakes, they could control how well they responded to them through preparation, training, and community cooperation. Earthquake had been the worst day of his life, but the experience of surviving it and helping his community recover had also been among the most meaningful. He had learned that human beings were capable of extraordinary resilience when faced with seemingly impossible challenges, and that disasters could bring out both the worst and the best in people. A photo on his office wall showing the collapsed remains of his former office building, not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of survival and renewal. Below it was a quote he had written: "We cannot choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we respond. In our response lies our strength."